Hey guys, Peter here to do an album review. Today I'm here to tell you all about the latest from Red Moon Architect. Emptiness weighs the most, out October 23rd on Noble Demon. This album has 9 tracks, 47 minutes in length, and this is the band's 5th full-length studio album. I'm always expecting something different from these guys because they're not your traditional metal band. They like to work outside the box and perhaps get rid of the box altogether. This album was no different. I mean, perhaps a little bit more standard than their previous record, but definitely still outside the box. As I went through the album, I didn't really realize the changes or the evolution that this record has to offer to the listener from a vocal perspective and from a musical perspective. It was not until the last song on the album that I realized that a lot had changed from the first track to the last track. And I was wondering, how did this happen without me noticing? How do I get to the last song on this album and I have a song that is so different from anything else on the album, and I didn't see getting to this point. I didn't see myself traveling through the record and ending at this destination. And then I started thinking about it. The record changes, but it changes in a very subtle way from song to song and within the songs themselves. So as a listener, you're so engulfed in the atmosphere that the album has to offer that these changes are so subtle, they're so minimal, that it just kind of goes unnoticed. It goes underneath the radar. And with every single change, you become used to it because, once again, it's very subtle. So you don't notice it. You just kind of absorb it. It becomes part of what you're expecting. Then the next track comes along. Something else changes a little bit, but you take it all in because it's all part of that bigger picture, of that atmosphere that they're creating. And then by the time you get to the last track, and the last track is so obviously different, then is when you stop and you wonder, how did I get here? What has happened? Where was I? So you allow yourself to then go back into the record and realize that this was coming, that this was the destination that was pretty much obvious from the beginning of the record. You just didn't see it because you weren't looking at it. It was there for you, but you weren't looking at it. You were just completely immersed in the overall sound that this album has, and the melancholy that this record has. Is a very slow burning album, so you just kind of get lost in its atmosphere, and all of these changes become completely obscure to you until it smacks you in the face with the last track on the record. So congratulations to the band for creating once again an album that feels different from anything else that I've ever heard before. I love this dynamic of the album. I love this growth, this expansion of sound, this creativity behind of creating songs that offer you something different, but in such a subtle way that you don't necessarily realize how much you've grown with the album until you reach the end of the record. Musically, this album is very crisp, very clean. It has such a concise sound. I love how you can almost feel all the different elements coming at you through your headphones. Everything is in its own space, in its own place, allowing each and every single one of them to have its own spot underneath the sunshine, so you can listen to the guitars, you can hear the drums, you can feel the bass, the keyboards. Everything is coming at you in a very clear and concise way, so you can digest every single element on its own. But then when they come together to create the music on this record, they don't overstep each other. Each and every single one of these elements has its own place, its own path, and they allow themselves to intertwine with each other in a perfect way, in a perfect symbiosis, in order to create this melancholic wall of sound that comes at you with every single song. Once you get deeper into that sound, I think there's one element that, in my opinion, is perhaps the most important element of them all, and that is the keyboards. They don't have necessarily this huge role. The songs are not driven by the sound of the keyboards, and I'm glad that they're not. But they play such an important role because they create this beautiful atmosphere that allows the overall album structure to stay linear across every single song. Without the keyboards, this album does not work. You lose that glue that holds musically this album together, and that allows the overall structure of the album to be one that's very linear from the first to the last track, because this is an album that stays together because of the atmosphere that it creates. It's not necessarily the inner dynamics of each and every single song. It's not necessarily the overall structure of the album that holds it together. No, it's the keyboards and the atmosphere that they create. This is the glue that holds this album together, that holds these 9 different songs together, and that creates this linear, bumpy path from the first all the way to the last track. Vocally, I love the duality. I really do. having Ville with his harsh vocals and Annie with her clean vocals is just absolutely outstanding. They did a wonderful job knowing exactly where one needed to be and where the other was needed, so that you can get the most out of each and every single track, and you can get the most out of the two of them as well. Now, there's an interesting aspect as far as vocals are concerned, because I felt that the vocals also offer growth throughout this record, because as the album starts, Ville has more of a protagonist role. He's the main focus of the first couple of songs, at least as the album gets started. As the album progresses, you see him moving more into almost a backing vocals kind of role, and Annie starts to take more of the front stage, and she becomes the protagonist. So the two of them change roles, which I find a very interesting dynamic. Because by the time you get to the end of the record, she has a song which is just her. It's like her solo track. So I love this dynamic. Normally, when you have two vocalists with these different styles, you see them miss and matching them throughout the whole record. In some songs, you use one in the verses, and the other one you use the other in the chorus, and you alternate them throughout the tracks, throughout the songs, in order to keep the record as balanced as possible. Now, they still kept the record balanced vocally, but they did it in a way where they change roles. You start, like I said, with Ville as a protagonist, and she's the backing vocalist almost. This is kind of the two roles that they have, a primary role and a secondary role. As the album progresses, the two of them start to move across each other, and they switch roles. Really interesting dynamic, really interesting approach, and it wasn't really clear to me until I got to the end of the record. Like everything else, it took me until the end to smacking me in the face and realize what the hell had happened in the previous 8 songs. Such an interesting album from a construction perspective, such an interesting album from a musical and vocal perspective, and how it's delivered to the listener. I love this record. I think it's one of their best records to date. I think it's one of the most interesting albums, very dynamic, outside the box, but not enough outside of the box that really will upset a lot of the fans of the band. Their previous record was really outside the box, so this one brings them a little bit more into the fold, but still a different album in how it's approached and how it's put together and how it's constructed, but a magnificent record all around, from the sound quality to the production value to the vocals to the dynamic of changing roles between the two vocalists, changing protagonists, if you will, as the album evolves. A record that's constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly growing. Just so much life in this record. Now, as far as songs are concerned, I want to start off with One Shines Brighter. I love the keyboards on this track. Annie has a more predominant role as far as her vocals are concerned, and Ville takes more of a backstage backing vocals, if you will. And that's very interesting, because when they use him in this track, not only he has that secondary role, they hide him a little bit into the mix. And that's something they actually do quite a bit throughout this album. When he's not the protagonist, they hide him a little bit in the mix, and he's a little bit hidden. He adds volume with his vocal approach. He adds a lot of presence, and he does that on this track. But this is a song that has great atmosphere, most of it coming from that keyboard melody that I think is very important throughout this record. The vocals have that duality between the two. She's more in the forefront, he's more in the background, but it allows the song to have these changes, at least enough changes to keep the listener engaged, because it's a very slow burning song, as it is the album, and you need something to change the dynamic of the tracks and to change the dynamic of the overall record. And this song has that ability, because you're using the two vocalists in a very distinct way, and allows the song to have these necessary ups and downs. Next, Into the Light starts slow, it builds up in volume, and the sound gains a lot more presence as the song moves along. The harsh vocals really help with that. I felt that the clean vocals in the background added presence, added volume. It doesn't necessarily change much, because you have the harsh vocals more in the forefront, and they add a little bit more of that volume, of that presence that the track really needed. Has great melody. The guitars offer a little bit of grittiness on this track, and I really like that. They're not just there to give you melody, they're not just there to take you along, hold you by your hand, and take you from the beginning of the track to the end of the track. They also offer a little bit of grittiness that plays really well with the harsh vocals and how they're used on this specific song. But this is a track that has a clear break between verses and chorus. The verses are more clean, and the chorus are a lot heavier, has a lot more meat on the bone, and the two are very distinct. There's an abrupt break when you go from one to the other, and that is what gives the song the jolt that it needs in order to change, so that it's not mundane, it doesn't become repetitive or monotonous as you go along the track from beginning to end. Last but not least, one of my favorite songs on this album and the last track on the record, My Beloved. Keyboards, Annie's vocals, the rest is history. It's done. This track is absolutely magnificent. It's so haunting, it's so beautiful, and it's one of the most inspiring songs on this album. Annie's best vocal performance comes on this track. Absolutely glorious and magnificent. She is outstanding as far as her voice and her vocal performance is concerned. I love the keyboards. I love the melody that it has. I love how haunting, how stripped, how naked it is. And then her voice on top of it just gives this song so much heart, so much soul. Even when the guitars and drums come into the track, and the song gains not necessarily heaviness, because this is not a heavy song, but the song definitely gains a lot more presence. It becomes more robust. It becomes more of a metal track, if you will, because up until this point, it really felt like a stripped down ballad. So once the song becomes a little bit more substantial, even then her voice is still magnificent. Even then the song is still very haunting, very melodic, and very beautiful. So it adds volume, it adds presence, it makes the song bigger, but it doesn't take anything away from how the song feels and from overall how it sounds, because it still has that haunting aspect, that haunting melody and atmosphere to it. I love this track, and what a closing track. And then when you get to this song, like I said, you realize, how did we get here? A song where only Annie's vocals are present, where there's a very clear difference. There's a very clear break from this track to the first or the second track on the album, because the first track is an intro. So from the second track on the album. And how did we get here? And that's when you start to realize that the changes were very subtle. They were happening through every single song on the album, and that allowed them to get to this point and finish the record with a ballad, a stripped down, beautiful, haunting ballad that you just don't see it coming until you're there. Alright guys, this is it. This is Red Moon Architect with Emptiness Weighs the Most, out October 23rd on Noble Demon. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.